The winter of 1880s Montana had come early that year. By the first week of November, the hills surrounding Thomas Reed's ranch were already covered in a hard white crust, and every morning the wind carried the sharp smell of snow. The cottonwood trees stood bare against a gray sky, their branches rattling whenever the northern wind swept down from the mountains. Thomas Reed, 42 years old, stood beside the barn before sunrise, staring at the cattle through the frost-covered doorway. There were fewer of them than there should have been. That was the thought he tried not to think. 3 years of poor harvests had drained his savings. The previous winter had killed several calves, and the year before that, an early frost had ruined most of his barley. Then his wife, Margaret, had died after a long illness, leaving Thomas to raise their 2 children alone. Samuel was 10. Clara was 7. They were the only reason Thomas still climbed out of bed every morning. He rubbed his frozen hands together and looked toward the farmhouse. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, but the smoke was weaker than it should have been. Thomas knew why. There was hardly enough firewood left. Inside the house, Samuel was trying to make breakfast from the small amount of flour remaining in the pantry. Clara sat near the stove wrapped in an oversized wool blanket, watching the flames. "Is Papa coming?" she asked. "He'll be here," Samuel answered, though he wasn't certain. A few minutes later, Thomas stepped inside, bringing the cold with him. "Morning," he said quietly. Clara looked up. "Did the cows eat?" "Enough," she smiled, satisfied with an answer that would have sounded inadequate to an adult. Thomas removed his coat and hung it beside the door. He glanced at the pantry without meaning to. Samuel noticed. "We still have flour," the boy said. Thomas forced a smile. "Of course we do." It was a lie. They had enough for perhaps 6 days. Maybe 7 if they stretched it. Thomas walked toward the table and placed 3 small pieces of firewood beside the stove. Samuel stared at them. "That's all." Thomas nodded. The boy looked toward the window. Snow was beginning to fall again. That afternoon, Thomas rode into town to speak with the man who held the mortgage on his ranch. He returned several hours later with a folded notice in his coat pocket. He did not show it to the children. The deadline had been moved forward. If he could not make the next payment by spring, the ranch would be seized. Thomas had spent his entire life on that land. His father had built the original barn with his own hands. Thomas had married Margaret there. Samuel had taken his first steps across the kitchen floor. Clara had been born in the little bedroom facing the western hills. Losing the ranch would mean more than losing property. It would mean losing the last piece of his family that remained. That evening, Thomas sat alone at the kitchen table after the children had gone to sleep. He opened the ledger. The numbers were merciless. Feed, flour, coal oil, veterinary medicine, mortgage payment. Every line seemed to tell him the same thing. He was running out of time. Thomas closed the book and pressed both hands against his face. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember Margaret. She had always been better with numbers than he was. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she used to tell him. But she was gone, and now he had no one. At least, that was what he believed. The knock came sometime after midnight. Thomas immediately reached for the rifle resting beside the door. Another knock, this time softer. He looked toward the children's room. They were still asleep. Thomas slowly opened the door. A woman stood on the porch. She appeared to be around 31 years old, though the exhaustion in her face made her look older. Snow covered the shoulders of her dark brown wool coat. Her boots were soaked, and a small leather bag hung from one hand. Her lips were pale from the cold. "I'm sorry," she said. Thomas kept one hand on the rifle. "Who are you?" "Eleanor Hayes." Her voice trembled. Thomas waited. "I was told there was a ranch somewhere along this road." "There are several. I was looking for work." Thomas frowned. "It's midnight." "I know." She looked down at her worn boots. "I had nowhere else to go." Thomas studied her carefully. There was no wagon behind her. No horse. Nothing except the small bag she carried. "You came here on foot?" "Yes." "How far?" "I don't know." That answer worried him more than anything else. Thomas stepped onto the porch and looked down the road. Snow had already covered her footprints. "You shouldn't be out here." "I know. There's a town several miles back." "I tried." She swallowed. "They wouldn't hire me." Thomas said nothing. Eleanor tightened her grip around the leather bag. Then she looked directly into his eyes. "I'll work for a roof over my head." The words were simple. There was no begging in them. No expectation. Just exhaustion and determination. Thomas glanced toward the dark kitchen behind him. "You know how to work a ranch?" I know how to work. That isn't what I asked. A faint, tired smile crossed her face. I know how to mend fences, milk cows, preserve meat, clean a house, sew clothes, care for horses, and cook with almost nothing. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Almost nothing. My husband used to say I could make supper from an empty cupboard. The smile disappeared as quickly as it came. Thomas understood. Where is your husband? Eleanor looked away. Dead. The word hung between them. Thomas lowered the rifle. He knew that particular silence. He had lived inside it for 2 years. Come in, he finally said. Eleanor hesitated. You can sleep by the stove tonight, Thomas continued. Tomorrow we'll decide what happens next. She nodded. Thank you. Thomas stepped aside. Eleanor entered the house. The warmth made her shoulders tremble. Clara appeared at the hallway entrance, half asleep, clutching her blanket. Papa, Thomas turned. Go back to bed, sweetheart. Clara stared at Eleanor. Who is she? Thomas looked at the woman standing quietly near the door. This is Eleanor. Clara studied her for several seconds. Is she staying? Thomas didn't answer immediately. Eleanor did. If your father lets me. Clara looked at Thomas. Then she smiled. Let her. Thomas almost laughed. It was the first time his daughter had sounded hopeful in weeks. The next morning, Eleanor proved that her promise had not been empty. Before Thomas even came inside from feeding the cattle, she had swept the kitchen, washed the dishes, repaired a torn blanket, and started a small pot of stew using vegetables Thomas had forgotten were still stored in the cellar. Samuel watched her from the doorway. You don't have to do all that, he said. Eleanor glanced at him. I know. Then why are you? She smiled gently. Because it needs doing. Samuel seemed to consider that answer. Then he walked away. Thomas entered carrying 2 buckets. He stopped when he saw the kitchen. What happened? Eleanor looked over her shoulder. I cleaned. I can see that. You said I could work. Thomas put the buckets down. You don't have to prove yourself in one morning. I wasn't proving anything. She returned to the stove. I was hungry. Thomas almost smiled. For the first time in months, the house smelled like something other than cold ashes and loneliness. Over the following days, Eleanor became part of the rhythm of the ranch. She never demanded attention. She simply worked. She rose before sunrise, helped Thomas with the animals, prepared breakfast, mended clothes, and made every scrap of food last longer than Thomas thought possible. She also noticed things he had stopped seeing. A broken hinge on the chicken coop, a leak in the roof, a weak fence post, a sick calf. She repaired what she could and pointed out what she couldn't. Thomas began listening. Samuel remained cautious. But Clara followed Eleanor everywhere. She wanted to learn how to knead bread. She wanted to know how to sew. She wanted to help gather eggs. And Eleanor never pushed her away. One evening, Thomas came inside to find Clara asleep against Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor was quietly stitching a tear in the girl's dress. Thomas stopped in the doorway. For a moment, he saw Margaret sitting in that same chair years earlier. The memory hurt. But this time, it did not feel entirely empty. Eleanor looked up. I hope you don't mind. Thomas shook his head. No. He looked at his daughter. She likes you. I like her too. Thomas nodded. Then his eyes fell on the small pile of flour beside the stove. He stared. Where did that come from? Eleanor looked at him. The pantry. I thought we were nearly out. We were. Thomas frowned. Eleanor explained that she had mixed the remaining flour with ground oats and dried potatoes to make enough bread for several more days. Thomas stared at her. You made that much from what was left? Yes. He slowly shook his head. You should have told me. You have enough to worry about. Thomas looked at her carefully. You know about the money? Eleanor hesitated. I know you're worried. That isn't an answer. No. She lowered her eyes. I don't know everything. Thomas said nothing. But Eleanor could see that the wall around him had gone up again. She did not push. She simply returned to her sewing. A few days later, a black horse appeared at the edge of the property. Thomas recognized the rider immediately. Silas Boone, 55 years old, wealthy, sharp-eyed, and always dressed as though he had never known hardship. He rode through the gate without asking permission. Thomas stepped. Outside, Silas dismounted. Thomas. Silas. Silas looked toward the farmhouse. Didn't expect to see company. Thomas's jaw tightened. She works here. Silas smiled. Works? Yes. Silas glanced toward the barn. Your cattle look thin. They'll make it. I wouldn't count on it. Thomas said nothing. Silas reached inside his coat and removed a folded paper. You remember our agreement. Thomas stared at the paper. I remember. The payment is due in spring. I know. And if you can't pay. I know. Silas smiled. Then you know what happens. He tucked the paper away. As he mounted his horse, he looked toward the farmhouse again. Winter's going to be hard, Thomas. Thomas watched him ride away. He did not answer. That evening, Eleanor found Thomas standing alone beside the barn. You know him well? She asked. Well enough. He wants the ranch. Thomas looked at her. He wants what I owe him. Is that the same thing? Thomas gave a bitter smile. Not anymore. Eleanor was silent. Thomas looked toward the dark hills. I may lose it. She did not offer false comfort. Instead, she said, then we should figure out how not to. Thomas turned toward her. We? Eleanor met his eyes. You said I could work for a roof. She looked toward the farmhouse. I intend to earn it. For the first time, Thomas realized that Eleanor Hayes had not come to his ranch because she believed he could save her. She had come because she was willing to save herself. And somehow, without either of them realizing it yet, she was about to become the person who would help save everything he had left. The winter tightened its grip on the ranch. By the middle of December, the world outside Thomas Reed's farmhouse had become a landscape of white hills, frozen creek beds, and black trees bending beneath the weight of snow. The road into town had nearly disappeared, and every trip beyond the ranch carried the risk of being stranded. Woke to the sound of cattle bellowing. He grabbed his coat and ran outside. The wind was howling. Part of the western fence had collapsed beneath the weight of the snow, and several cattle had escaped into the darkness. Stay inside, Thomas shouted toward the house. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. What happened? The cattle got out. Thomas mounted his horse. I'll bring them back. Eleanor looked toward the snow-covered pasture. They're heading north. Thomas nodded. I know. No. She pointed. They aren't going toward the pasture. Thomas looked. The cattle were moving toward the ravine. His face changed. He kicked the horse forward. Eleanor disappeared back into the house. Thomas thought she had obeyed him. He was wrong. Minutes later, he heard another horse behind him. He turned. Eleanor. She was riding hard. You told me to stay inside, she shouted over the wind. I did. I decided not to. Thomas almost shouted again, but there was no time. The cattle had reached the edge of the ravine. Thomas and Eleanor split up. He rode around the western side while she approached from the east. One frightened cow slipped. Eleanor dismounted immediately. She grabbed the animal's rope and pulled with everything she had. The cow struggled. The ground beneath Eleanor's boots began to crumble. Thomas saw what was happening. Eleanor. She looked up. Move. She pulled once more. The animal stumbled backward. Eleanor fell into the snow. Thomas reached her seconds before the edge gave way. He grabbed her arm. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas pulled her to safety. You could have died. So could the cattle. You could have died for a cow. Eleanor looked at him. It's not just a cow. Thomas stared at her. It is one of the reasons your children will have food in spring. Thomas had no answer. They returned to the ranch before dawn. Eleanor's coat was torn, her hands were bleeding, and she was shivering. Thomas brought her inside. You're staying by the stove. I need to check the animals. I'll do it. You don't know which one is injured. I'll figure it out. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas pointed toward the chair. Sit. For once, she obeyed. He wrapped her hands in clean cloth. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was something else. Something neither was ready to name. As December passed, Thomas began relying on Eleanor in ways he had never expected. When a horse became sick, she recognized the symptoms before he did. When the roof began leaking, she found the weak section and repaired it. When the children needed warmer clothing, she turned old blankets into coats. And when Thomas returned from town one afternoon looking defeated, Eleanor didn't ask him what had happened. She simply placed a cup of coffee in front of him. Eventually, he spoke. Silas. Eleanor looked up. He offered to buy the ranch. Did you accept? No. Why? Thomas stared into the cup. Because it isn't his. Eleanor smiled faintly. No. Thomas looked at her. It isn't. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Eleanor sat beside the stove. Snow tapped against the windows. Thomas finally spoke about Margaret. Not everything, but enough. She was better at this than I was. At what? Keeping a family together. Eleanor looked into the fire. My husband wasn't good at keeping anything together. Thomas looked at her. She continued quietly. He borrowed money. Lost money. Made promises he couldn't keep. Was he cruel? Eleanor took a long breath. Not always. Thomas understood that answer. He died owing more than we had. That's why you came here. Yes. She looked at him. I didn't want another man's charity. Thomas nodded. You never asked for it. I know. For several minutes, they listened to the fire. Then Eleanor said something Thomas did not expect. I was afraid when I first came here. Of me? No. She looked at him. Of needing someone. Thomas felt something inside him tighten. He understood that fear. After Margaret died, he had decided that needing another person was dangerous. Because people left. Because people died. Because sometimes love meant eventually learning how to live without the person you loved. Eleanor lowered her eyes. I thought if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have to depend on anyone again. Thomas looked at her. And now? She smiled sadly. Now I think maybe that's not the same thing as being strong. Thomas did not answer, but he remembered her words. The next morning, a letter arrived from town. The military supply post was willing to purchase barley when the roads opened. It wasn't enough to save the ranch completely, but it could cover a major portion of the debt. Thomas read the letter twice. Eleanor watched him. It could work, she said. It could. For the first time, Thomas allowed himself to believe there might be a spring after all. But Silas Boone had not given up. A week later, he arrived with 2 men. He found Thomas repairing a fence. You're wasting your time, Silas said. Thomas kept working. What do you want? I hear you're planning to sell barley. Thomas stopped. Silas smiled. You're not the only one with connections in town. Thomas's face hardened. Silas stepped closer. Take my offer. No. You're stubborn. That's what my father used to say. Silas laughed. Your father wasn't raising 2 children with an empty pantry. Thomas dropped the hammer. Leave. Silas's smile disappeared. You'll regret this. He rode away. That evening, rumors began spreading in the nearest settlement. Somebody claimed Eleanor had come to the ranch because she knew Thomas was vulnerable. Someone else said she was trying to become mistress of the property. Another said Thomas had lost his judgment since his wife's death. Thomas heard the rumors when he went into town for supplies. He came home angry. Eleanor noticed immediately. What happened? Nothing. Thomas. He shook his head. You don't need to know. Eleanor stepped closer. If it concerns me, I do. Thomas looked at her. People are talking. They always do. They're saying you came here to take advantage of me. Eleanor went still. And what do you think? Thomas didn't answer quickly enough. Her expression changed. I see. That isn't what I meant. Then what did you mean? Thomas struggled for words. I meant that I don't want them using you against me. Eleanor's voice softened. Or against you using me? Thomas looked away. The misunderstanding hung between them. Eleanor returned to the kitchen. That night, she packed her small leather bag. She didn't leave immediately. She simply placed it beside the door. Thomas saw it the next morning. You're leaving. I should. Why? Because you don't need another problem. You're not a problem. Then why do I feel like one? Thomas had no answer. Eleanor looked toward the children's room. I care about Samuel and Clara. Thomas said nothing. I care about this place. Her voice broke slightly. But I can't stay somewhere I'm only tolerated. Thomas stepped toward her. You aren't. She looked at him. Then tell me what I am. Thomas froze. He could have said many things. Friend, partner, family, but none of them seemed big enough. Before he could answer, Clara appeared in the hallway. Are you leaving? Eleanor turned. Clara's eyes filled with tears. I don't want you to go. Eleanor knelt beside her. I'm not leaving yet. Thomas watched them. Then Clara suddenly coughed. Once. Twice. Her face went pale. Eleanor immediately touched her forehead. She has a fever. Thomas rushed forward. Within hours, Clara's fever had risen dangerously. The roads were buried. The nearest doctor was miles away. Thomas panicked. Eleanor did not. She boiled water, prepared cold cloths, kept Clara hydrated, and stayed beside the child through the night. Thomas sat helplessly nearby. At one point, Clara opened her eyes. Eleanor. I'm here. Don't go. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I won't. Thomas looked at Eleanor. She had been prepared to leave only hours earlier. Yet now she was risking everything to care for his daughter. As dawn approached, Clara's fever finally began to break. Thomas sat beside Eleanor. You stayed. Eleanor looked at him. I told her I would. Thomas nodded. Then, quietly, he said, Thank you. It was a simple sentence. But Eleanor understood what it meant. The walls between them had begun to fall. Outside, the The wind grew louder. Thomas looked toward the window. A storm was coming. Not an ordinary storm. The kind of storm that could bury the ranch completely. The cattle were still weak. The western fence was damaged. The barley was vulnerable. And the road to town was already disappearing. Eleanor stood beside Thomas. How bad? He watched the snow begin to fall sideways. Bad. How bad? Thomas looked at her. Bad enough that we may not see another sunrise. Eleanor's face remained calm. Then we'd better make sure we do. The storm arrived before dawn. There was no gentle beginning to it. No warning beyond the sudden silence of the animals and the strange darkness that settled over the sky. Then the wind struck. It slammed against the farmhouse walls hard enough to shake the windows in their frames. Thomas Reed woke instantly. For a moment he lay still, listening. The children were asleep in the next room. Eleanor was already awake. She stood near the window, watching the snow move sideways across the glass. It has started, she said. Thomas climbed out of bed. How bad? Eleanor looked at him. I've never seen snow move like that. Thomas pulled on his coat. We need to check the barn. You're not going alone. I have to. No. Thomas looked at her. The cattle. I know. She picked up her coat. Thomas shook his head. You're staying here. Eleanor stared at him. You said that before. And you ignored me. I did. Eleanor. The last time I ignored you, we saved the cattle. Thomas almost smiled despite himself. That's not a good argument. It worked. He sighed. Fine. Stay close to me. They stepped outside. The wind nearly knocked Eleanor backward. Thomas grabbed her arm. Keep your head down. They fought their way toward the barn. Snow struck their faces like handfuls of sand. The western fence was almost completely buried. Several cattle were trapped in the far enclosure, but the main barn looked worse. The roof had begun to sag. Thomas stared upward. If that roof comes down, we lose them. Eleanor looked around. There has to be another way in. There isn't. She pointed toward the northern side of the property. What about the old irrigation path? Thomas frowned. That path was abandoned years ago. It still runs behind the hill. You can't see it under this snow. I can. How? Eleanor pointed toward a line of old fence posts barely visible through the storm. They follow the path. Thomas looked carefully. She was right. They moved toward it. Halfway there, Thomas's horse stumbled. Thomas jumped down. The animal's front leg had broken through a thin layer of ice. Easy. He tried pulling the horse free. The ice cracked again. Leave him, Eleanor shouted. Thomas shook his head. He's valuable. He's going to drag you under. Thomas continued pulling. Then the ground gave way. His leg plunged into the frozen creek beneath the snow. He fell hard. Eleanor grabbed him before he disappeared completely. Thomas. He clung to the edge. Don't let go. I won't. She dropped to her knees and pulled with both hands. Thomas tried to climb. The ice broke again. For several terrifying seconds, Eleanor thought she would lose him. Then Thomas managed to get his elbows over the edge. Eleanor pulled him onto solid ground. He lay in the snow, breathing heavily. She looked at him angrily. You could have died. Thomas laughed weakly. You already told me that once. I meant it both times. He looked at her. Even through the storm, he could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear for herself. Fear for him. Thomas reached for her hand. I'm all right. Eleanor didn't answer. She simply helped him stand. They abandoned the horse and continued toward the barn. The old irrigation path led them around the worst section of the ranch. When they reached the barn, they discovered that 3 cattle were trapped beneath a collapsed beam. Thomas immediately went to work. Eleanor held the lantern. Lift. Thomas pushed upward. The beam moved only slightly. Again. He strained. Nothing. Eleanor looked around. There's a lever. She grabbed a long piece of wood and positioned it beneath the beam. Push here. Thomas followed her instructions. Together, they raised the beam enough for the first animal to escape. Then the second. The third was injured and could barely stand. Eleanor crawled into the stall. Thomas shouted over the wind. Be careful. She reached the animal and wrapped a rope around its chest. Pull. Thomas pulled from outside. Eleanor pushed from behind. Slowly, the injured cow moved. Then they heard a terrible crack above them. The roof. Thomas looked up. Move. They ran. The barn roof collapsed seconds after they cleared the doorway. Snow and timber crashed into the ground. Thomas stood frozen. Eleanor touched his arm. We got them out. He looked at the cattle. All of them were alive. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something stronger than fear, hope. They returned to the farmhouse near sunrise. Thomas was soaked and shaking. Eleanor forced him into a chair beside the stove. You're staying there. He looked at her. You sound like me. Someone has to. She removed his wet coat and wrapped him in blankets. Samuel appeared in the doorway. Are the cattle safe? Thomas nodded. All of them. The boy smiled. Clara ran toward Eleanor and hugged her. Eleanor closed her eyes. For a moment, the storm outside disappeared. Inside that small farmhouse, there were 4 people holding on to one another. The worst of the storm lasted 3 days. For 3 days, the ranch disappeared beneath snow. The family lived on carefully rationed food. They burned the last of the weaker firewood. Thomas repaired what he could from inside the barn. Samuel carried water. Clara sorted beans. Eleanor kept everyone fed. No one complained. No one talked about leaving. They were simply waiting. On the 4th morning, the wind stopped. Silence returned. Thomas opened the door. The world outside had changed. The fences were buried. The barn was half destroyed. Trees had fallen across the road. But the ranch was still standing. Eleanor stepped beside him. We survived. Thomas looked at her. We did. The weeks that followed were hard. But spring finally came. Snow began melting from the hills. The creek ran again. The cattle returned to the green pasture. And the barley survived. Not all of it, but enough. Thomas loaded the grain onto a wagon as soon as the roads became passable. Eleanor stood beside him. You're sure this will be enough? No. She smiled. That isn't very reassuring. Thomas smiled back. But it's our best chance. He drove toward the military supply post. 2 days later, he returned. Eleanor was standing on the porch when she saw him. Thomas climbed down from the wagon. He looked exhausted, but he was smiling. Well? Eleanor asked. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out the receipt. Sold. Eleanor stared. How much? Enough to pay the mortgage. She covered her mouth. Thomas laughed. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders seemed to disappear. Silas Boone arrived 3 days later. He expected to find Thomas defeated. Instead, he found him standing beside a repaired fence. You've paid the debt, Silas said. Thomas nodded. Silas looked toward the farmhouse. Then toward Eleanor. I suppose congratulations are in order. Thomas smiled. They are. Silas turned his horse. He had nothing left to say. After he left, Thomas walked toward the porch. Eleanor was sitting beside the steps. You did it, she said. We did. She shook her head. No, you did. Thomas sat beside her. I couldn't have. Eleanor looked at him. You would have. No. He was quiet for a moment. When you arrived, I thought you were just looking for shelter. I was. I thought you needed me. Eleanor smiled. I did. Thomas looked at her. But I needed you too. She looked away. Thomas continued. You saved the ranch. Eleanor shook her head. We all did. You saved my children. So did you. You gave this house life again. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean to. I know. Thomas reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small piece of paper. Eleanor frowned. What is that? Your agreement. She unfolded it. It was the original note Thomas had written when she first arrived. A roof. Food. Work. Nothing more. Thomas tore the paper in half. Then again. Eleanor watched him. You don't owe me anything anymore. I know. He looked toward the ranch. But I don't want you to leave. Eleanor was silent. Thomas's voice became softer. Not because I need someone to work. She looked at him. Then why? Because this place isn't the same without you. Eleanor's eyes filled. Thomas continued. Neither am I. She looked down at her hands. When I came here, I thought I was asking for a roof. Thomas waited. I didn't realize I was walking into a home. He smiled. You don't have to leave. Eleanor looked toward the fields. The ranch had nearly killed them. The winter had tested every ounce of strength they possessed. But the land was green again. Samuel and Clara were running through the pasture. Their laughter carried across the morning air. Eleanor smiled. I'll stay. Thomas nodded. Good. There was a long silence. Then Clara shouted from the field. Papa. Eleanor. They both turned. Samuel was standing beside her, waving. Thomas stood. Come on. Eleanor rose beside him. They walked down the porch together. Not as employer and worker. Not as strangers. As a family. That evening, the 4 of them ate supper together at the same table where Thomas had once counted his final handfuls of flour. There was enough food now. Enough wood. Enough hope. Thomas looked around the room. For years, He had believed survival meant holding on to what remained after loss. Now he understood something different. Sometimes survival meant allowing someone new to become part of your life. Eleanor had arrived at his door with one small bag and nothing else. She had asked for nothing but a roof over her head. Instead, she had helped rebuild a broken household, saved a dying ranch, and reminded Thomas that a heart could open again after grief. Outside, the last patches of snow melted beneath the warm Montana sun. The fields stretched green toward the mountains, and Thomas knew that winter had taken much from them. But it had also given them something neither of them had expected: a home, a family, and a future they would build together, one quiet day at a time.